Uh, I'm I'm Kimonas Sotirchos. I'm one of the leads of the Manifest Working Group, and again, I'm very happy to be part of this summit, especially considering the fact that if in the previous summit I was just a developer, in the previous summit we didn't even have a Manifest repo that well established. So I think the progress from the last summit is huge. So what I want to do is actually, again, give at least a little bit of an overview of what is the Manifest Working Group responsible for and what can you expect out of the Manifest repo. And then I'll give a heads up to some of the major efforts that we've have going on. We're also discussing quite a lot of this in the release team meetings. So this is also a small suggestion to also join these meetings as well if you're interested in the general life cycle of the release of Kubeflow. So without further ado, the first question is, what exactly does the Manifest Working Group maintain? And the answer might sound straightforward, but we might need a little bit more explanation. So what Manifest does is we actually keep the Manifest repo is a central place to store all of the manifests from the different components of Kubeflow. Everything that we expect that the users might need to be able to launch Kubeflow, all of this is gathered into one place. Now, keep in mind that for the majority of for its majority, the manifest repo does not contain any development manifests. All of the development of the components and their manifests happen in their own dedicated repositories. For example, for the training operator, we have manifests, but these manifests are always copied from the Kubeflow training operator repository. Same thing for pipelines, same thing for Katib, same thing for Kubeflow. So this is just a quick heads up to anyone listening and watching. The manifest repo does not actually accept any changes for the underlying base manifests. If you have any change that you'd like to do, you're urged to do that in the component's own repository. So what you are encouraged to do, though, is to use this repository. And since we're using only customizing this repo, you can create any overlay that you want on top of any of the components. So before continuing, I'd like to also give a little more attention regarding to what are the components that we have in manifest. And specifically, and first of all, we have the manifest of all of the components that are developed under the GitHub organization of Kubeflow. This is a very simple definition. Anything that's under the Kubeflow org, this is what we've had under the apps folder. Next up, since we cannot just have a list of different components to construct a platform, we need some other common components that can make the platform even more robust. Some of them include, but are not limited to, of course, Istio for the security layer and the network mesh, Knative, aggregated Kubeflow roles, which all of the components are also aggregating in order to be able to ensure that the users in their namespace will be able to have permissions for all the resources of Kubeflow. For example, for notebooks, we're aggregating the default Kubeflow role with permissions on notebooks. And when a user is added to a namespace, they get a role binding to that role. So they automatically get permissions for notebooks out of the box. And these Kubeflow aggregation roles are critical also to the whole platform. And last but not least, we also have a list of contrib components. We might also use the terminology add-ons here and there. We're not that much strict yet on that department, which are components that are maintained, whose code is maintained outside of the project, but we also have their manifests inside of the repo, because for some of them, and all, if not all of them, they have use cases where they can be integrated with Kubeflow, and some users might be interested in keeping and swapping some of them, which was also always one of the core principles of Kubeflow, to allow users to be able to tailor the platform to their need and be able to add more functionality based on their needs. And with that, I'll actually start talking about some of the ongoing efforts that we have. on the manifest repo. And as you see, the biggest one that we have, especially considering the fact that we don't do any dedicated development into this repo, is testing, testing, and again, testing. So the first thing that we really want to do and are eager to do with testing is we need to move away from GitHub Actions for our heavy tests. So for those that might not have not been following the Kubeflow news lately, we had a little bit of a rant on the testing infrastructure that we had. We had to do a change the last year and migrate away from our previous platform infrastructure solution where we were using Prow and Argo workflows to run our tests. And we have sort of fallen into the intermediate solution of GitHub Actions. Now, I really love GitHub Actions because they're easy to understand, but they have some serious limitations for what we do right now, and especially on the free tier that we are. Specifically, actually, the first problem is that we can't install the whole Kubeflow installation just with the GitHub Actions. And this is really very, 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 very frustrating because we have, as a community, developed some end-to-end. Actually, it's more like on the integration side of things, some integration tests that allow us to spin up and test resources throughout the whole Kubeflow stack, from deploying a CADIP experiment that launches a TF job, a training operator job, to spawning a pipeline, all the way to Kaiser. And all of that is streamlined into scripts. And it's really heartbroken in the fact that we cannot run this with GitHub Actions, since the GitHub Actions only give us like 1.5 CPUs and 7.5 gigs of RAM, again, on the free tier that we are. And one of the reasons that we actually really want to move away from GitHub Action is the fact that we have so many AWS resources that also a very big, huge thank you to Suraj Kota and his team that have really pushed forward to give us. And these resources are currently not utilized. And the last and quite important reason that we need to move away from GitHub Actions is the fact that as a community, we also had a lot of expertise around both Prow and Argo. Now, of course, this does not mean that since this is what we always did, this is what we need to do. But at least in my 2 cents is, since we already can get back to a very similar architecture to what we had with Prow and Argo, but just swap the underlying layer with AWS resources, then this is also an interesting way to look into. But in any case, the discussion about what end-to-end testing solution we're going to follow is something open to that we're really keep on continuously actually evaluating. So if you have any more feedback or expertise around how you're doing it in your organization or with your as a user, we would really, really, really love to hear your feedback. The next improvement that we really want to do on testing is to actually get even more integrated testing between components, because integrated testing is never enough. And we can always go one step deeper by checking even more components with each other, more complicated testing suites that will test different components and how they interact together, APIs, and how all the components, and ensure that the components can work all along in an installation and with all the dependencies that we have, whether this is Kubernetes, Cert Manager, Istio, everything, you name it. The next, also quite important thing and testing suite that we really need to invest to is end-to-end browser-driven tests. And these are the tests that we expect users to just log into the platform, and what would they do from there? Which means, how do I once I log into Kubeflow, can I also always ensure that I can create my notebooks the way that I expect them? Can I monitor pipelines the way that I'm used to? Are my CADIP experiments working as expected and I'm seeing what I'm expecting? So this is one huge area that we want to improve. Although a small note on both the end-to-end test and the integration test is a lot of this burden also falls into the dedicated working group repositories. While Manifest aims to try and test how everything ties together, its goal is not to go too deep into its dedicated component. And this is where narrowing and navigating into the balance of what to expect from manifests and what to expect from the working groups. To give you a very brief summary of what we currently have is right now we have some very basic, I'll call them integration tests, nothing for the browsers yet, but for the integration test, we have some tests that will ensure that all of the that we will spin up some resources from each major component. For example, if I update the pipelines manifest, we're going to run a basic pipeline to ensure that the pipelines component works as expected. If I update the CATIP manifest, we're going to run an experiment and wait for it to complete. And these are the basic integration tests that we have. And currently, we also have a script for running a more integrated test around, as I mentioned before, spinning an experiment that spins up a TF job, that spins up a pipeline, that also spins up a case or inference service. But this is yet not automated. And this is really one of the limitations that we had with GitHub Actions, and the fact that we could not fit all of these components into one runner and do this in every PR. And this is why we want to move to a more robust solution. So this is our testing. Oh, but of course, how could I forget? We also need to have a more robust platform, because we need to start looking into more Kubernetes versions that the project needs to support. Now, I'm not really going to make any huge promises that the project is going to start supporting 2 or 3 Kubernetes versions at once. But if we really want to go towards that direction, we need to ensure that we will have automation in place that will allow us to be able to run the same tests across different Kubernetes versions to ensure that everything works, at least at the narrow window of versions that we choose, whatever that window is. So now that we have testing going on orthogonally, one other item that we've been hearing users feedback for so long is the fact that the manifest working group would fallen a little bit behind on the customized version that we use. Now, we really want and are targeting to support customized 4.5 in Kubeflow 1.7. But before actually exposing or giving any promises, I'd like to just take one very brief moment to expose why we haven't moved into the latest version of Customize. I put the link here for everyone that wants to follow, but the very short answer is Customize had a specific way of ordering the resources. Once you do Customize build, you're going to see a list of all of the YAMLs, but this list is generated by a specific order. For example, you're always going to see your namespaces first, then you're going to see your CRDs. So this is one thing to keep in mind for Customize. And the second thing from Kubeflow side is the fact that we've chosen to have everything to be a customization. And the whole goal of this effort is to be able to also have a whole customization for the Kubeflow installation. This is why we have in the README file a one-liner command that users can use to install Kubeflow. The problem with Customize 4.5 and the latest version was that in Customize 4.0 and afterwards, there was a regression in the ordering that Customize used to do. And that regression had to do with mutation webhooks. So previously, Customize would order, when you do Customize build, it would order and create mutation webhooks before creating any deployments. This changed into the latest Customize 4.0. And what this results is, if you build all of your YAMLs at once and apply them, now deployments will be applied before mutation webhooks. Now, the mutation webhooks will be created shortly after the deployments, but what this results into is a race condition where some pods might be created before some webhooks, for example, the Istio one, gets created. So we might end up with some pods that will not have an Istio sidecar, although they are expected to have a sidecar, and there are authorization policies that expect that. Now, another counter argument there is, okay, but maybe we should not have a one-liner installation. While we're really in favor and like the idea and want to support having a one-line installation, we also have manual instructions for how someone can install different parts of Kubeflow. So For Kubeflow 1.7, what we're targeting is we want to ensure that we have fully updated the manual instructions on the one hand to ensure they're up to date, and we do the weights on the correct points. So when you're doing a manual installation, you know that, okay, I'm at that point of the installation, the Istio is installed. Let me continue the rest of deployment. But for the one-liner as well, we want to ensure that that we will allow the full YAMLs that will be applied with the one-liner to be correct. And to do that, we're already pushing the customize front to also have this feature in. So this is what, as I mentioned, we want to ensure the one-liner work and clean up the manual instructions. Let me check. So again, we really want to have customized 4.5 in Kubeflow 1.7. Manual instructions will be up to date, and we'll keep everyone posted with regards to the latest notes on customize. We might even need to go beyond 4.5 if they decide to merge the feature in a later version, but in any case, we will give a detailed explanation of what the status is going to be. And last but not least, what I would like to mention for Manifest is a discussion that we've had going on at least in the last month, and it's actually great to see more users driving this effort. And it's a discussion about how to integrate with new components in Kubeflow. Now, we've already had a formal proposal about it, where we tried to go over what we expect from the different contrib components or add-ons. But let me also briefly go over that live with you as well. So first of all, let me go over some of the goals that we have. Specifically, the goals for this proposal is to describe some very high-level expectations from the quality that we expect from any component that wants to be integrated with Kubeflow. And the way this can be done is by having documented use cases and examples, so that when users are browsing the different contrib add-ons, they can know why they might want to use it and how they might want to use it. Now, while this all sounds good, we have a very specific non-goal. And at this point in time, we really do not want to imply any product-wise requirement for adding the components. The role of the Manifest working group is not to actually provide that much the guidance on why should a component be part of the add-ons or not. This will be up to the maintainers of the component to thoroughly expose the use cases, and up to the users to find the value and if they want to use that component. But for this discussion, what the Manifest working group mostly cares about is to ensure that the manifests are up to date. They have some process on how to update them, and users can install the manifest along with the Kubeflow installation. Now, with that in mind, let me also go a little bit through some of the requirements that we have. The first one is we expect all of the components to have, again, keep in mind that these are all at this point high level. We're not really going too deep into the technical details. So we expect all of the components to have some clear instructions on how to use the component, some examples and use cases, because this, again, will really help the users themselves evaluate if they really want to use a component, why should they use a component, and how to use the component. The next one is we should always expect the components to work with the latest versions of Kubeflow releases. And this falls to the Manifest working group as well, to ensure that, also with the coordination with the maintainers of the components, that the components need to be usable from latest versions. The goal of having these components is to have a good user experience where people can just jump into the project and try out different solutions. And we're actually going to be very strict about the support for Kubeflow releases. And we have also a deprecation plan in case components fail to accommodate to these needs. And quite an important aspect from having each component, and this is something that I would personally like to start having more and more the community to keep in mind, and speaking from the notebooks perspective, this for the migration from workbenches as well, is we really want everyone to start thinking more about upgrade instructions between versions. Kubeflow is at the point where we're getting more and more stable, and we cannot expect to be changing, for example, annotations in the last minute, since there are a lot of users that have their own components on top of what we provide. And we need to ensure these are always stable so that people's installations will not break once they just migrate from one installation, one Kubeflow version to the other. And although, as I mentioned before, these are just some very high-level definitions and requirements for the components, I haven't really gone into any technical detail of how should a component behave or how should it be integrated with Kubeflow, because at that point we only expect the manifest to be up to date. All the other discussions like security, compatibility with the other components like profiles and user namespace. At this point, we're a little bit open and not very strict with how the components themselves will implement it. But we have on the horizon the next steps to actually start defining more strict functional requirements, both from a security side of things, but also from integration with the rest of the components. And to give some examples, one is namespace isolation. As I mentioned before, we have some specific aggregated roles that we expect all of the components to aggregate so that users can get permissions to objects. So with the same rationale, we also expect users to either be able to automatically have access to objects that are created. For example, a new contrib component might introduce a new CRD. We must expect that if the user in their own namespace will have permissions to create these objects in their own namespace. And on the other side of the discussion, we must expect that users that do not have permissions in namespace A will not be able to touch these resources. Oh, I covered both in the two items. And the next one is, aside from custom resources, some of the components might have some servers that might act on behalf of the users. One such striking example is most of the web apps that we already have in Kubeflow. For example, the web app we have for launching Jupyter notebooks is acting on behalf of the user. The user connects to the browser and clicks on deleting a notebook. And this delete request will go all the way to the backend. And then the backend will need to be able to say, okay, is the user that just asked me that they want to delete a notebook in namespace A actually authorized to delete a notebook in namespace A? And this impersonation check actually is always implemented with subject access reviews. And for this reason, we need to ensure that all the extra add-ons and components that have servers that might act on behalf of the users will need to respect Kubernetes RBAC and not allow users to be able to jeopardize a cluster and touch anything in any namespace. Then, although we're getting a little bit away from the security side, is integration with a central dashboard. While we really like new additions to the API level, we also always want to have in mind in Kubeflow that we really also want, whenever possible, to stay away from kubectl. We really want users to be able to interact with the components via the web, via their browser and the web apps. So this is why we believe it's pretty crucial for any add-on that will have some manipulation of some resources, that they will also have a web app that can be integrated with a central dashboard. It's not, again, it won't be like necessary, but if they have a web app, it will need to be integrated with a dashboard. And that means being able to get the namespace from the dashboard and being rendered inside of the iframe. And also quite important, but might not always be the case. Maybe in some cases, it might make sense to have a KFP component if that's needed. But again, this is not going to be a hard requirement since it's up to the component, and also it's not that much up to the manifest working group to dictate that. It's mostly a suggestion to have. So I think I've covered everything I've had, barely. So these are the major efforts that we have going on with manifests. And again, we're discussing them both in the release team and in the manifest working group meetings. So testing, Customize 4.0, and better integration with external components. And with that, again, many thanks to the Kubeflow sponsors, and really happy to be part of the summit. Thank you.